Sylvia Barbara Soberton is a historian and author who joins me today for a discussion all about Anne Boleyn and witchcraft. Witchcraft is a subject that has, in popular imagination, had close ties to Anne Boleyn, but many historians refute claims that Anne was actually ever accused of being a witch during her downfall in May 1536. But Sylvia has uncovered evidence which gives us pause for thought on that front, and that actually there is a lot more to the story than initially believed, and in particular the massive mistranslations of Nicholas Sander's work that have coloured our perception of Anne Boleyn. Today we cover all of this and much more as we explore the notions of exactly what witchcraft was in the context of Anne Boleyn's story. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest Podcast, episode 71, Anne Boleyn and Witchcraft, with Sylvia Barbara Soberton. Welcome to the Tudor Chest Podcast, Sylvia Barbara Soberton. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for inviting me again.
Oh, you're welcome. It's lovely to have you back. So, last time you were on, we had a chat about Gertrude Courtenay, the rather controversial wife of the Marquess of Exeter. This time we're talking about another controversial figure, albeit one who's significantly more famous, and that's obviously Anne Boleyn. And we're here today to talk about witchcraft and the subject of witchcraft around Anne Boleyn and all that encompasses. Before we get on to that discussion, just a few icebreaker questions. So can you just tell me, for those who may not know you or haven't seen your previous episode, where you're based and what you do full-time?
So I'm in Slovenia and I'm a full-time author.
And focusing just on history?
Just on history and especially on the Tudors and the 16th century. I sometimes go back in time into the 15th century, Wars of the Roses. But in general, I'm based in the 16th century, yes. And I'm very lucky to do what I love to do.
Yes, it's great, isn't it? Can you remember what sparked your passion for 16th century English history? Was there a moment that you can think of?
Well, I loved history in general as a child. And like you see, my career path took me to 16th century England. My interest was sparked, believe it or not, by the Tudors, the TV show that aired first season aired in 2007. And Jonathan Rhys-Meyers starred as Henry VIII.
Yes.
I can't bring myself to rewatch that series now.
Yeah, I'm a Tudor snob, but I really don't have a lot of time for it.
But at the time when I was young and impressionable and I didn't know any better, I loved it. And I really dissected that show, what's real, what's not, what's accurate. And it really took me on this path. I first started a blog. And then it's kind of snowballed from there. So here I am, thanks to Michael Hurst, who directed that TV show. It was really about the Tudors for me. Yeah,
it's funny. It's invariably for people there is a gateway drug to the Tudors, and it's normally either a film or a television series. And for a lot of people, it is the Tudors. And it's I infamously struggle with that show. I'm not a big
for our generation, it's the Tudors, But if you think about it, really, it was 18 years ago, season 1, 18 years ago. Can you imagine? I feel so old saying that.
Well, my gateway, I'm only in my late 30s, but for me it was Anne of 1,000 Days, because I saw, even though it was released.
But you are from the UK originally.
Yeah.
And I don't think that Anne of the 1,000 Days was that popular where I was born. I was born in Poland.
Yeah.
I now live in Slovenia. I moved to Slovenia when I was 20. And so really, the Tudor history wasn't very popular either in Poland or in Slovenia. But in the UK, it's different because you grow up having this history and you had it at your doorstep, right? Because you grew up near such where the Nonsuch Palace stood.
Yeah,
once stood.
Nonsuch Park.
So when you live in the UK, you are surrounded by history, and it's a lot of times it is Tudor history.
Yeah.
And you learn it at school. We don't, because it's not really part of that our cultural part of our culture. But it's really great to be able to kind of share the phenomenon that the Tudors were, because it's aired globally and it was very popular in a lot of countries. And I know I totally understand you struggling with it, because I struggle with it now. I was like, I can't bring myself to watch that seriously. I'm not even joking. But maybe I will one day. Who knows?
There were just some strange decisions they took. And, I always, whenever I look back on it, I always think they cast the perfect Henry VIII in season 1, but the
Duke of Buckingham. I know,
Duke
right?
of Buckingham, Stephen Waddington, he would have been a brilliant Henry,
Yes.
but
Brilliant. Absolutely.
there you go.
Absolutely.
I mean, I
Brilliant.
came to Anne of a Thousand Days because it was around the time I was learning about the Tudors for the first time in school. And by just pure chance, I was about 10. By pure chance, Anne of a Thousand Days was on TV. And my mum let me watch it. And that was my way into Anne Boleyn's story. That's how even though the film came out, long before I was born, that's how I was introduced to Anne Boleyn in a big way.
Well, it was a great film. I watched that several times as well.
Yeah,
It's not my favorite, Anne Boleyn. It's not my favorite, but it's a good one.
Yeah,
it's a good one.
It's my favourite, closely followed by Claire Foy, which I know is a controversial one for a lot of people as well. So before we get into the chat about witchcraft and Anne Boleyn, just one more question, which is there a Tudor mystery that you would love to solve?
A Tudor mystery. Well, I would love to know what Anne Boleyn really looked like. If that's a mystery, I would really like to know. Like my next book that's going to be released later this year, it's about the secrets of the Tudor portraits. And I've spent a lot of time researching Anne Boleyn's portraiture and wondering, what did she really look like? Like, it's not the most important part of her life, of course, but just to learn what she really looked like. That's the mystery that I would really like to solve. And I'm a firm believer that there is a portrait of Anne Boleyn out there somewhere, either mislabeled or hiding in someone's attic or in a private collection.
I totally agree. And I think that, it's same. I'm exactly the same as you. It would be, I'd love to know what she really looked like. What did she genuinely look like? And I'd love to know what she sounded like as well.
That's a good one as well.
What was her pitch? How did she actually sound? Because that's something we just can never know. I think that would be so interesting. So we are here today, as we said, to talk about Anne Boleyn and witchcraft and what that encompasses. It's an interesting subject because there is this, I suppose a lot of people have this preconception that Anne Boleyn was accused of witchcraft, and a lot of people get very angry about that because, as we know, that wasn't necessarily something that was definitely in the charges against her. But to start, there are two schools of thought when it comes to Anne Boleyn and the stories of witchcraft. So what are these schools of thought? Can you explain them to me?
So the first one is that she was never accused of witchcraft during her lifetime. And the second one is that Nicholas Sander, who is the author of the most popular description of Anne Boleyn's appearance, that he was trying to depict her as a witch. Now, I can also add the third misconception, or maybe a school of thought, that she was accused of witchcraft during her trial. That was repeated in older books about Anne Boleyn, refuted by modern scholars, but I don't necessarily agree with the modern refutation because we don't have a full record of Anne Boleyn's trial. And when we look at what we have, it's clear that Henry VIII was trying to accuse Anne of witchcraft and annulled their marriage based on that accusation, as we will probably be discussing today.
Okay, so based on that, are there specific stories that you can sort of walk me through that can be convincingly refuted that tie Anne Boleyn to witchcraft? Yes,
they can be refuted. And I discussed that in my paper, which was published in 2024 The paper is entitled Large Vein or Swelling, Exploring Myths and Misconceptions about Nicholas Sanders' Description of Anne Boleyn and its Link to Witchcraft. It's also open access, so if anyone wants to just read it for themselves and see exactly what my arguments are, I highly recommend reading that. I will send you the link so that you can put it when you release the podcast episode. Yeah.
Okay, great. You've mentioned Nicholas Sanders there. So clearly Nicholas Sanders' description of Anne Boleyn, it plays a large role in the witch legend. But is it correct to say that actually the English translation of Sanders' work wasn't made until quite recently?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so Sanders' work was published posthumously in Latin in Germany in 1585. But it wasn't translated into English until 1877 as the rise and growth of the Anglican schism. The translator was David Lewis. And it's really interesting because Sanders' book was translated in languages such as Spanish, German, French, Polish. So it's interesting that it wasn't published in English until so late, until the 19th century. But the people read Sanders' book in original. For example, we have Gilbert Burnet in the 17th century who made a point-by-point rebuttal of Sanders' descriptions of Anne Boleyn, of Elizabeth, and so on. And also George Wyatt, Anne Boleyn's first biographer, also dispelled some of the myths created by Sanders. And interestingly, also, in the 19th century, the reason why Sanders' book was translated so late in the 19th century is because in the 16th century, it was this whole debate about was Anne Boleyn guilty? What did she really look like? And stuff like this. And of course, Elizabeth I, who was Anne Boleyn's daughter and who lived and ruled in England, it wasn't really in her best interest to have Sanders' work circulating in English, although Latin was the language of the learned people, and those who wanted to read it in original, they read it and wrote rebuttals and stuff like that. But not until the 19th century, when the public could read it widely, was it published.
I see. Okay, so can you walk me through the description that he makes of Anne and how this then fed into the witch legend?
Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit of a long description, but it's necessary for us to quote it at some length because it's important for the later discussion. So I'm just going to cite Sanders right now, this excerpt about Anne Boleyn's appearance. So he says that Anne Boleyn was rather tall of stature, with black hair and an oval face of a sallow complexion, as if troubled with jaundice. She had a projecting tooth under the upper lip, and on her right hand 6 fingers. There was a large vein under her chin, and therefore to hide its ugliness she wore a high dress covering her throat. In this she was followed by the ladies of the court, who also wore high dresses, having before been in the habit of leaving their necks and the upper portion of their persons uncovered. She was handsome to look at, with a pretty mouth, amusing in her ways, playing well on the lute, and was a good dancer. So that's the description.
It's wildly contradictory in many ways because he suggests that she's basically an ugly old harridan, and then he says she is good looking.
Yes, exactly. And it's one of the reasons why I believe he was not trying to portray her as a witch.
Okay.
Because witches were usually, when Sanders was writing, of course, if he would have wanted to portray her as a witch, he would have portrayed her as an older and not beautiful, because witches were considered ugly, and beauty could only come from God. So when he says there that she was handsome to look at, he clearly means that she was not a witch. And we will also discuss later how this came about, who actually proposed that Sanders was trying to link Anne with witchcraft.
In the accusations he makes, obviously it's difficult because we don't, as we've already discussed, we don't know exactly what Anne Boleyn did look like. But is there anything that we do know from descriptions that does actually chime with things that Sanders has claimed, or is it all, would you say, made up?
Mm-hmm. So Sanders was writing in Latin in original. He was also writing in rhyme, and he was trying to be funny. So it's really difficult. And I understand the translator's efforts because it's difficult to translate that into English so that it makes sense. Because when you read it in Latin, you say, "Oh, it rhymes. It's funny. It's good job, good job there, sender." But it's difficult with translations, and so the large vein that appears in the 1877 translation, in original, Sanders said something that she had something swollen under her chin, but what he didn't know. And it's interesting that it's a large vein in the translation. The word large doesn't appear in the original, manifestly so. But I think it's inspired by the 1533 anonymous description from Anne's coronation, where the anonymous witness says that she had a swelling and that she covered it with a partlet, so like a standing collar. And that scrofula made her look monstrous, an illness. Now, we also have in Sanders' description, we have a high dress covering her throat. But that's, again, a translator's invention because the original doesn't say anything about high dress.
Because that also wouldn't have been... That's also been one of the things that a lot of people comment on, is the fact that 1530s clothing, women did not wear things that were high-collared.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, well, Eric Ives, Anne Boleyn's most famous and prominent biographer, thought that high dress was a reference to an Elizabethan ruff, such as we see in portraits of Elizabeth I and her courtiers. And of course, that dates from later period, not from Anne Boleyn's time. But the original doesn't mention high dress at all. It only says that she covered her neck and chest. It doesn't say that she used high necks or high ruffs to cover herself. So that's another misconception about Sanders' description. And it could have been avoided very easily if historians writing about Anne in the 1980s would have made an effort and returned to that original.
Yeah, so mistranslations have massively impacted this description of Anne.
Exactly, yes.
It almost sounds like, based on what you've said, that Sanders' description, it was meant to be a comical poem, really.
We can say so, yes.
Was he adverse to Anne Boleyn, though? Did he?
Yes, he was definitely adverse to Anne Boleyn, and I understand his decisions. But at the same time, his descriptions of Anne Boleyn were rooted in fact. It's not like he's making stuff up. I've seen so many times an argument that Sanders was only about 6 years old when Anne Boleyn died and that he probably never saw her. And that may be correct, perhaps so, but it doesn't really matter because he was repeating what was known about Anne Boleyn at the time when he was writing. So, for example, dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin. We do have descriptions from contemporaries that Anne Boleyn really looked like that. We don't know about the projecting tooth or...
I was about to ask about the tooth, the wen, the extra finger. Those are
Well, we don't know, but perhaps she had something that later circulated and grew to become this prominent tooth. Well, in the original, he does mention that she had a sixth finger on her right hand, so it's not a mistranslation. But George Wyatt, Anne Boleyn's first biographer, he dispelled some of Sanders' descriptions, and he said that Anne Boleyn had only a little show of a nail on one of her fingers, which again, I think, in the retelling of Anne's story, grew to become the sixth finger. So I wouldn't take Sanders' description at face value that it's definitely true, but it's definitely inspired by what was circulating about Anne during Sanders' lifetime. And to return to your question about whether he was adverse to her or not, yes, he was, because he perceived Anne as a heretic, as somebody who seduced Henry VIII, who opened the floodgates of heresy in England. And of course, Anne Boleyn's daughter was queen at the time, Elizabeth I. So he was trying to depict Anne as adulteress, as heretic, as seductress, but definitely not a witch.
So what role to modern audiences, as Retha Warnick's assessment of Anne Boleyn's miscarriage, has that impacted the witchcraft theory as well?
Well, in general, Retha M. Warnick is responsible, I guess, for making that connection between Anne Boleyn, Nicholas Sander, and witchcraft. So she interpreted the large vein from Sanders' description as the witch's teeth or the witch's mark. And it kind of snowballed from there into this theory that we have today. Now, a witch's teeth was a mark hidden usually in privy parts or kind of a birthmark. And that's why the interrogators during the witchcraft, witch hunts, were looking for all those marks hidden on a woman's body. Now, Anne Boleyn's swelling was visible. So by definition, it does not align with what witch's mark was about. So we can say that Rita and Warnick built this huge theory based on a mistranslation. And how it led her there, well, large van is one thing, and the Anne Boleyn's miscarriage is another, as you said. So Warnick interpreted Sanders' description of Anne's miscarriage in January of 1536 as indication that Anne gave birth to a deformed fetus and that it sparked the accusations of witchcraft. Sanders wrote that in January 1536, Anne Boleyn gave birth to a shapeless mass of flesh. Now, to our understanding, it does seem like he's suggesting that Anne gave birth to a deformed child. But in the 16th century terms, the shapeless mass of flesh meant that a miscarriage happened. And we have an example of Margaret of Austria, who in 1499 gave birth to a stillborn daughter, and one of her contemporaries, one chronicler, wrote that she gave birth to a shapeless mass of flesh. Now, nobody has ever made a comment or accusation against Margaret of Austria that she was a witch or that her child was deformed. The shapeless mass of flesh appears to be part of 16th century terminology for a miscarriage or a stillbirth. So again, we must be careful as historians not to apply our understanding of the words, because in 16th century, some of those words and terms meant something entirely different. Like, like they say, past is a different country. So we have to tread very carefully there.
Yeah, and there's also the simple fact that this was an age when their ideas around obstetrics and giving birth and everything was much more rudimentary than we know now. And so an early miscarriage, the fetus is not going to be especially formed. Although with this one, we do know that it was, by all accounts, far along enough for them to determine that it was male. But when you factor in the poor knowledge of the body and how it all worked, compounded with terminology, that's going to, I suppose, cause some confusion.
Well, the deformed births, for example, that I also mentioned in the paper, when a child was born and it was visibly deformed, some theories had it that God was punishing the parents, but mostly the mother, for some kind of sins. And with Anne Boleyn, when she was pregnant with Elizabeth in 1533, rumors started spreading that she gave birth to a monster. So to suggest that her relationship with Henry VIII was irregular, was sinful, and that's why she gave birth to a monster. Of course, Elizabeth was a healthy baby girl, and those were just rumors. But a deformed births were perceived as punishment from God for sins. And that's why I think Rita and Warnick was influenced here to suggest what she suggested. But of course, the shapeless mass of flesh didn't mean what she thought it meant.
Rita Warnick has done a lot of damage to Anne Boleyn over the years.
Yes, but she also made her book is, I love that book because it was one of the first books that I ever read about Anne Boleyn, together with Ives's biography. And those are two different looks at Anne Boleyn. And although Rita and Warnick introduced some theories that are not that don't stand to closer scrutiny, but her book is, in general terms, it's not a bad book. It's a good one. There are a lot of details there that are not to be found in other books. She has some interesting theories and ideas about Anne's queenship, for example. But the theory about the witchcraft, as I said, it doesn't really stand up to close scrutiny.
So a lot of people now believe that Anne was never accused of witchcraft during her own lifetime, but this isn't quite correct. So can you explain to me what she was actually accused of and by who?
So during the years of Anne Boleyn's meteoric rise to power, there were some people who didn't like her. And I'm referring here to the Pole family, to the Courtney family. And of course, you are very familiar with the Poles because you wrote a book about Reginald Pole. And during the interrogations of Geoffrey Pole in 1538, during the Exeter conspiracy, the so-called Exeter conspiracy, Geoffrey Pole said that, yes, he and his family and his friends talked about Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, divorce, and so on. And he says during the course of this interrogation that they believed that Henry VIII was caught in the snare of unlawful love with the Lady Anne. Now, the comment about unlawful love looks quite innocent to us today, but it carried witchcraft connotations to 16th century minds. So unlawful love was among the witchcraft charges. It wasn't yet punishable by death, but it was among the witchcraft charges. So it meant basically that people, usually women, were accused of saying incantations, using charms or potions to make men fall in love with them. And in 1536, when Henry VIII was trying to annul his marriage to Anne Boleyn, in January, he said that he was seduced by witchcraft, and I think he tried to capitalize on those rumors that were rife during Anne's ascendancy. Now, another rumor that circulated at the time was that Henry VIII must have been charmed by potions. And it was said by one of Charles V's envoy, who had a conversation with Anne Boleyn's protege. Chronicler Edward Hall said that Anne Boleyn enticed the king, that he wanted to divorce his wife. Now, the word enticed carried witchcraft connotations as well. And last but not least, we have also Eustace Chapuis, Charles V's ambassador, who believed that Henry VIII's obsession with Anne bordered on unnatural. He wrote in 1533, for example, that this accursed lady has so enchanted and bewitched Henry VIII that he will not dare say or do anything against her will and command. He also said that she was a diabolical concubine. So again, he linked her with the devil. He says that she's accursed, that she enchanted Henry, she bewitched him. So he's also not the only one, although he tends to be dismissed. But if we look at the whole picture, at all of the examples, it makes sense that people whispered and spread rumors that Anne Boleyn must have used witchcraft to seduce the king.
I suppose the other thing that we should factor in here is Anne's own character and her looks as well. How did this, the way she looked and the way she behaved to her detractors, how was this used to blacken her reputation?
Well, so Anne Boleyn wasn't really considered beautiful, so an explanation was needed why she attracted the king's attention in the first place. Now, I've seen a suggestion that Sanders' description of Anne Boleyn's hair, he described her hair as black, that it linked her to witchcraft, but it wasn't black, but red hair that was considered an indicator of witchcraft. So that's an interesting thing to consider. Now, I could give you an example of another woman who was in a very similar situation as Anne Boleyn. That woman's name was Alice Perers or Alice Salisbury, and she lived in the 14th century. She was the mistress of Edward III. She was also said to have enticed the king into an illicit love affair, and it was said that she used witchcraft to do it. Now, Alice used effigies it was said, of course, again, she was accused, but she was not guilty of witchcraft. People just tried to find an explanation why, like somebody who's not beautiful or particularly smart was a mistress of the King of England, right? So she was accused of creating effigies representing herself and the king, using herbs and incantations and magic rings. And we see these similar things playing out in Anne Boleyn's case as well, because the word enticed carried witchcraft connotations. We have rumors of magic potions, of unlawful love. So we see this, again, people trying to make sense of why this particular woman, who is not perhaps the most beautiful, why does she attract the king's attention? So it was a form of a smear campaign, I guess, because how do you get rid of a woman who is influential, who's powerful? And how do you do that without antagonizing the king? Because if she's using witchcraft, then Henry VIII was seduced against his own will, right? So you can't really blame him.
And I suppose because she's dark, this is an age when blonde hair, blue eyes, that's what's in vogue at the court. That's the look that people strive for. And Anne is the antithesis of that. And I suppose I remember, I think it was Wolsey who said it referred to her as the Night Crow. So it's another sort of nickname that has this dark.
Yes, but dark hair, and that's another misconception, that dark hair, dark skin, dark eyes, that this would link her with witchcraft. It wouldn't. And also that it wasn't considered attractive. I mean, say that to the Italian women in the 16th century who were all, with dark hair, olive skin, beautiful dark eyes. It's not really about that. It's more about... yes, maybe Anne Boleyn's behavior, because she wasn't married to the king. She was his mistress, although not in a carnal sense. She wasn't particularly beautiful. We have contradictory descriptions of Anne from people who never saw her. So, for example, at the beginning of the divorce case, a Venetian ambassador says in 1528, Henry VIII is going to marry Anne Boleyn, who is said to have been very beautiful. And then we have somebody in Rome from Catherine of Aragon's camp of her supporters, and that person says, well, she's said to be very ugly. So Anne Boleyn, she polarized opinion then, and she polarizes opinion today. But I would argue that it's not that much about what she looked like, but about that her situation, I guess, was so unusual. She was in an anomalous position. She was neither a wife nor a mistress. So people tried to get rid of her in any way they could.
The thing about Anne Boleyn we always have to keep in mind is to your point, the extreme irregularity of her position and what she represented. We're talking about a woman born to a middling nobleman who manages to overthrow a princess of Spain to marry Henry VIII. It's a remarkable story, and I think
it's remarkable, and it's highly unusual, because so far Henry VIII, he had mistresses, but none of them took the queen's place. So Anne Boleyn she's also creating here a very dangerous precedent for herself, because if Henry VIII could get rid of his wife and place a maid of honor in her place, then the same thing could happen, and it did happen to Anne Boleyn.
So in January, you've already touched on this briefly, but I'd like to explore it in a bit more detail. In January 1536, Chapuis reports a significant comment that Henry VIII is supposed to have made about his marriage to Anne. So what was this comment in particular, and what were the implications of it?
So there are two translations of Chapuis's dispatch. One is in the Letters and Papers series, and another is in Spanish Calendar of State Papers. Now, the version in the Letters and Papers reads that Henry VIII told to one of his great friends that he had made this marriage to Anne Boleyn, seduced by witchcraft, and for this reason, he considered it null, and that it was evident because God did not permit them to have any male issue, and that he believed that he might take another wife, which he gave to understand that he had some wish to do. The version in the Calendar of State Papers says that Henry VIII had been seduced and forced into the second marriage by means of sortileges and charms, and that he held it as null. Now, in my paper, I argued that Henry VIII was actually cleverly, I guess, laying the foundation for the accusation of witchcraft. He was trying to capitalize on the rumors that Anne had seduced him using witchcraft. So he was aware that witchcraft charge could lead to annulment of a marriage, and I think that was what he was aiming at. Henry VIII, of course, had examples of witchcraft used to annul royal marriages. For example, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester's marriage was annulled when his wife, Eleanor Cobham, was accused of witchcraft.
Yeah, I was going to ask about her.
And then we have closer to Henry VIII's time, Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was also annulled. And one reason was Edward's pre-contract to another woman, but witchcraft was also cited as one of the reasons. So ultimately, we know that Henry VIII accused Anne of adultery and treason, and the treason charge carried the death penalty. That's what ultimately killed Anne. But Henry VIII was aiming not only at annulling his marriage, he wanted Anne permanently gone, and that's what reveals Henry VIII's extremely brutal streak here, because the accusation of witchcraft would result in annulment, but not in Anne's death. So he wanted Anne gone, he wanted her dead. So he did not proceed with the witchcraft charge as the main charge, but there are glimpses of accusations in Anne's trial that can be linked to witchcraft. So he didn't really, he stopped there. He didn't invent the witchcraft charge, but we see this subtle hints that he tried to do that. He tried to accuse her of witchcraft.
So what were those in the trial? What were those things that had that witchcraft element to them?
So it is often stated as fact that Anne was never charged with witchcraft during her trial in May of 1536, but we know that the transcript of her trial is no longer extant. And so I think that such a sweeping statement cannot be made. But there are curious hints in the indictment against Anne Boleyn that during the preparation of the charges, Henry VIII was still pondering accusing her of witchcraft. We have the so-called Baga de Secretis, which means bag of secrets in Latin. And it contains files of indictments against Anne and her brother and the 5 men that were accused, the men that were accused as Anne Boleyn's alleged lovers. This document still survives in the National Archives. It's an amazing document. It's spread over 21 membranes, and it concentrates on the very lurid charges of adultery and incest allegedly committed by Anne. And this document states that following the discovery of Anne Boleyn's abominable crimes and treasons against himself, Henry, and I quote here, took such inward displeasure and heaviness, especially from his said queen's malice and adultery, that certain harms and perils have befallen his royal body. End of quote. Now, I think that this is a reference to alleged witchcraft performed by Anne. We have an example from Richard III's time when he accused Elizabeth Woodville of using witchcraft to waste his body. And I think that Henry VIII was implying that Anne Boleyn tried to do the same thing to him. Now, during the trial of George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's brother, who was accused to have been her lover, George was handed a piece of paper with information that Anne had confided in his wife, so in her sister-in-law, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, that Henry VIII, and I quote, was not skillful in copulating with a woman and had neither skill nor potency. End of quote. Now, the king would admit to having had erectile problems during the annulment of his 4th marriage to Anne of Cleves. Magically induced impotence was not uncommon in witchcraft cases or in annulment cases, but it was rarely used in England. But I think that by insinuating that certain harms and perils have befallen his royal body, Henry appears to have been protecting himself from rumors of impotence that he suspected would stem from the trial proceedings, because, considering that those accusations were of very private nature, the evidence was quite damning, and Anne Boleyn, I think with that comment originally, she tried to insinuate that she struggled to become pregnant, and it was not entirely her fault. But with Henry VIII, Henry VIII was Henry VIII, so he absolutely hated when somebody questioned his manhood.
Yeah, because it touched his manhood and what that represented. It was also, he was the country in a person. So it just had such wider ramifications for his reputation and the reputation of England. Yes. That's what it really came down to, wasn't it? Exactly,
yes, because if a man can't control his wife, if a king can't control his queen, then he can't really control his country. Yeah.
Can you just talk to me about a couple of examples you mentioned of other earlier witchcraft accusations? particular Eleanor Cobham, that's a really fascinating one, because she ends up being imprisoned for years, doesn't she?
Well, she died in prison. I touched upon her example because it was such a prominent cause célèbre, as they say it. She was very important. She was the Duchess of Gloucester, wife of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Humphrey was the uncle of Henry VI.
He was a younger brother of Henry V, wasn't he? Yeah.
Yes. And Eleanor, she wasn't from very high nobility either. So she has something in common with Anne Boleyn there. They married for love. And Eleanor was very ambitious. She wanted to learn from astrologers whether her husband had any chance of becoming king, because at the time Henry VI didn't have a wife.
Yeah.
So he didn't have children and didn't have heirs. And so she was interested in that question of succession, and she had a horoscope made, reading of the stars and so on. And some people took that as an act of treason. But of course, Humphrey also had enemies who tried to maybe destroy him by getting to him through his wife. That's also a very popular method of destroying a man through his woman. And ultimately, we know also that Eleanor was accused of using love magic. So that's how it was insinuated that she tampered with Humphrey's free will, and therefore he married her under duress. So if a man married a woman under duress, or if witchcraft was involved, or there was a suspicion of that, the marriage could have been annulled, and it was annulled in Eleanor's case. So I think when Henry VIII made that comment in January of 1536, he really knew what he was doing. It was not a comment like, I was seduced by witchcraft. No, it was a foundation for what was to come.
Yes.
And I believe that he already pondered Anne Boleyn's demise in January, but he quickly realized that accusing her of witchcraft wouldn't lead to her death, and he wanted her gone. So very brutal man, Henry VIII, wasn't he?
He was indeed, yes. So obviously in May 1536, Anne is arrested, tried and beheaded. After her death, how quickly did the witchcraft accusations start to proliferate? Was it coming up almost straight away?
Well, that's the thing. The witchcraft accusation didn't proliferate at all. She was remembered and disparaged as an adulteress. And it wasn't until the early 20th century that her name starts to be linked with witchcraft. That's interesting.
Yeah, so because to your point, Nicholas Sander never actually calls her a witch.
Exactly, and nobody picks up on it until Rita M. Warnick in the 1980s. So that's how we have this theory now, which I hopefully debunked in the paper.
Yeah.
Because I think my belief as a historian is that we can't rely on the documents that were translated like 100, 200 years ago. We have to go back and double check if those translations are correct. And in Anne Boleyn's case, this translation that so many theories were built upon is inaccurate.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you that this is not the only description. When a Tudor woman's later posthumous reputation is shaped by a theory built upon a mistranslation, but I can't tell you anything more about it.
Okay.
I will be a little bit secretive about it. I'm writing another paper. It's at the editing stage, hopefully to be published later this year. And it's going to change the way we see one very important Tudor woman.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. That sounds brilliant.
Well, it is. And I'm sure that we will be talking about that in another
I'm sure.
of your podcast, if you will invite me again.
Of course, as long as I get the exclusive.
You will. Trust me, you will.
So to conclude, basically, based on what you're saying, essentially both schools of thought, that Anne was and then wasn't accused of witchcraft, are kind of wrong. And that actually she was accused, but just not in the way that we perceive it.
Exactly, yes. So to conclude, Anne Boleyn was linked to witchcraft during her lifetime because people spread rumors about her allegedly seducing the king. That's how they use witchcraft as a weapon to get rid of Anne.
Mm.
Then we have Sander, who was not trying to portray her as a witch. That theory came much later in the 1980s. And Henry VIII seemed to have wanted to accuse Anne Boleyn of witchcraft. That was his original intent in January of 1536, but ultimately didn't proceed with a charge because it wouldn't carry the death penalty.
So my final question actually is a bit of fun, really, which is I'd like to know what you think about some of the more modern day references to Anne Boleyn and witchcraft. And what I'm talking about here is, for example, those people that love the Harry Potter films will have spotted that there's actually two portraits of Anne Boleyn in the halls of Hogwarts in the film series, the Harry Potter film series. She's used as a reference point as a witch a few times in the Netflix series, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. I kind of love it. I'm just curious to know what you think about these sorts of things.
Well, I'm going to be so boring here. I haven't seen Harry Potter. I haven't read the books.
Outrageous.
Sabrina, I haven't seen it. So, but I think it really shows you how deeply entrenched this witchcraft charge, and in Anne Boleyn's case, is.
Yeah. Exactly.
Deeply entrenched in popular culture. That's why it was one of the first things that I started researching about Anne, because I was really interested in witchcraft and in how the accusations were leveled against powerful women in various centuries. And so I was very curious about why do we say that she wasn't accused of witchcraft in May of 1536 when we can't really say that with 100% certainty, because we don't have the exact record of her trial, if you will. And so I think that this is still a very hot subject because people like to learn about witchcraft, because it's fascinating, it's gruesome, it's cruel, it's brutal. If you think about what those people accused of witchcraft went through. But at the same time, what's gruesome often fascinates.
Yes.
And so I think that witchcraft is fascinating because of that. And Anne Boleyn, well, she's fascinating in her own right. So if you put those subjects together, you have a very interesting mix. And that's why I think people are so interested in that, and why we have so many references in popular culture to Anne Boleyn and witchcraft.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's what it comes down to. It's living proof that story of Anne Boleyn, that aspect of her story, is still alive and well, and something that a lot of people enjoy and engage in. So thank you so much for coming back on and having a chat with me today about this fascinating woman and a side of Anne Boleyn's story, I suppose, that people think they know a bit about, but actually I'm sure people will be listening to this and going, okay, I really need to rethink how I approach Anne Boleyn's story based on what you've said about the witchcraft side of things. So you mentioned earlier, so I know you're working on a paper that you can't talk about. You said a moment ago, but your next book, are you allowed to say what your next book's about?
Yes, I am. So I already shared that on my social media accounts. My next book is entitled Secrets of the Tudor Portraits. And it's really about how the Tudors used portraiture to shape their image, to make political statements, to defend the legitimacy of their marriages, and stuff like that. One of the first examples that comes to my mind is, of course, Margaret Pole, the famous portrait that's in the National Portrait Gallery, but which frustratingly is not today identified as Margaret Pole. It's described as unknown woman, formerly Margaret Pole. And I can't think of any reason why we shouldn't believe that it's not Margaret, because she has this beautiful bracelet with a barrel on it, a subtle reference, coded reference to her father's execution, and a letter W, as a reference to the earldom of Warwick that belonged to her executed brother. So that's one of the, examples from the book, how Tudor people used portraiture to convey their messages, either secret ones or not so secret. So I'm very excited about that book.
Yeah, that will be one I will be diving into. That sounds like a bit of me. I think what makes the Tudors so, I think one of the big reasons why we love the Tudors so much is because we have such rich portraiture of them that and it's so frustrating that we don't have detailed portraits of the earlier Plantagenet kings.
Oh, yeah, that's a real one. Oh, I'm
annoying,
so sad about that.
Yeah, because you also wonder, like, what happened? You know, how did we go from drawings that look like they've been done by a 6-year-old into Hans Holbein? Like, where was what was the trajectory there? Why wasn't there a Plantagenet Hans Holbein?
I think there's a missing link there. Somebody must have been there whose works were lost to time.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah. Well, there's the Richard II full length at Westminster Abbey, and that was from life. And it's certainly not a Holbein quality, but it's certainly a lot better than what we have to work with elsewhere.
Or the Wilton diptych,
yes.
Also representing Richard. Yeah, very beautiful. Yeah. Like you said, I would really like to see original portraits of, let's say, Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV, Richard III, because we have only the copies that were perhaps based on lost originals, but nevertheless, those are copies.
Exactly.
And, the Tudor portraiture is amazing. Hans Holbein, he was creating paintings as if they were photographs. Yeah. If you look at them, you have a feeling that you are in the presence of the person who's in that painting. That's pretty amazing. And I've been able to make some interesting discoveries also in this book. So I'm very curious how it will be received. And I just can't wait to share that with people because I had so much fun writing that. Yeah. And I know it's a very unusual angle to look at the Tudors, but I think it's a very important one that we look at them through the portraits. Yeah. Because they conveyed messages and they wanted to be remembered in certain ways. And I'm trying to unpick that in the book.
Are you may not wish to say, but is the infamous double-chinned nightgown sketch that might be Anne Boleyn by Holbein, is that in there?
It is there. It is there.
Please refute it for me. I don't think it's her.
It is there where I discuss Anne Boleyn's portraiture. You know what? I think it's like 80% chances that it's her.
I just don't 80%. See it. I think the other Holbein sketch, I think is probably definitely her. But I realise I'm just projecting. I'm thinking it's not what I want Anne to look like.
Well, we all have our own opinions and theories based on evidence. And I think it's interesting that having the same sources, we can come to different conclusions. But that's the beauty of history, right? So we can have varying theories and still have fun debating them.
Well, as I said, thank you again so much for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me again. It was such a pleasure. Let's do it again sometime.
Well, as I said, thanks again. And yes, you will absolutely be back on, I'm sure, later this year once this new paper comes out. I can't wait.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Adam.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. My thanks to Sylvia for coming onto the show to discuss Anne Boleyn and witchcraft with me. If you have any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do reach out. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and speak soon.